Hello, and welcome to Introduction to Python. These content videos are going to allow you to refer back to the material and see a demonstration and discussion at any time. So I'm going to try to keep them short. If you feel that I'm moving too fast, you can always rewind the video, watch it again, which I highly recommend, or pause it in certain places. The very first thing that we want to talk about when we talk about any programming language is how it handles data. Because the fact is, regardless of which language you're working with, programs process data. You can think of your program as a very elaborate calculator. Any program that you use, whether it's Photoshop, some sort of single shooter video game, Excel, the Windows operating system, you're going to be talking about programs that process data. And how the language manages the data, allows you to work with the data, is what makes that language unique. Now, you may have been, even if you're brand new to programming, you may have been working in a language without realizing it. If you think about Excel, and I think Excel is really the best visual representation of what we're talking about, you may have used what you call an Excel formula. An Excel formula is simply a way of asking Excel to manipulate or calculate the data within the spreadsheet. So you can see that this function sum is summing up all the values between D2 and D8. It's one of the simplest formulas that you can use in Excel. Excel is, in a sense, supporting a programming language, and it's representing data for us. It's visual, so it's almost instantly recognizable because it kind of looks like an actual sheet that you might write down figures on. So these values are being stored in different cells, and we can think of those cells as variables. That is, it's a place where data can go for later retrieval and use. This is the first concept that we want to bring across. The concept of how data is stored in Python for later use during the program. And when I say storage, I'm not talking about disk storage. I'm talking about memory storage. That is, when the program is running, it needs to hold on to data. It needs to remember that data so that a second later, 5 seconds later, however long later, you want to be able to refer back to that data. In Excel, you can see it quite clearly. We have a bunch of values, and they're stored in cells. Now, if I wanted to refer to the number 2 up here, how do I refer to that number? I refer to it by its address, C2, right? Any one of these numbers is addressable. And of course, I can also create a range of these numbers to do something like a sum. Well, let's talk about how it's done in Python, because the very first thing we need to talk about is how does Python allow you to refer to data for calculations? Python uses a special abstraction called an object. The object is the central abstraction in Python. And when I say abstraction, I just mean how we talk about data. Let's talk about the most basic kind of data, the data that you would use to do math calculations, or maybe to represent strings, text information. We'll use these 3 object types, and these are the most basic object types in Python. They're the most central to what we do in Python, and they're going to allow us to work with any kind of data. Because most data can be, especially for what we want to do at this level, most data can be represented either as a number or as text. We use these 3 object types to talk about data, to be able to refer to data, and to communicate with Python about data. When you see the integer, for example, this is a whole number, and it is an object called the integer object. This value, 5.0, is what we call a float object. And this string which represents 7 characters, F-I-F-T-E-E-E-N, is a string object. Now, these are the basic objects that we're going to work with. And our whole way of discussing Python, talking about how Python is working and what it's doing, will be based around objects and object types. So let's look again at our first definition. An object is a data value of a particular type. Again, the types that we're looking at are int, float, and string. Just remember that these types are your new friends. They're the ones you're going to become very familiar with. You're going to understand how these objects work. And in fact, your whole thinking is going to be based around what does this object do? What can this object do? You can identify what type you're looking at by just looking at the syntax. 5 is an int because it's a whole number. It's what we call an integer, and Python refers to it as int. 5.0 looks like a float. It is a float. Even though we don't have a decimal place value, it's not 5.1 or 5.3, it's 5.0, and you can argue that that's just 5. Because we notated it as .0, because we placed a decimal there, it is a float value. Now, for the most part, we don't really need to worry too much about ints and floats because they play well together. They convert to one another pretty readily. We're just going to make you aware of it because it's the two most basic types that we can use. The string type, str, is an unquoted set of characters or sequence of characters. We can use double quotes here as well. Doesn't need to be single quotes. It can be single quotes or double quotes. I favor single quotes. You get to favor what you'd prefer, although I think most developers favor single quotes and then use double quotes when necessary, and we'll talk about why. So to recap, what we're talking about when we talk about data in Python is the objects. Each object is of a particular type, and there are only 9 types for us to look at in this entire class. Today, we're just going to look at the 3 types. Now, you can see that I'm printing my variables, and actually, let's talk about what a variable is. In order to refer back to values that we've created in our code, we need to create what we call a variable. A variable is a name bound to an object, or we can say it's also pointing to or referring to an object. And you can see what that looks like in this code. We've created a name called myInt. And by the way, we can call these names anything we want. myInt, myFloat, myXX, yourFloat. It really doesn't make a difference. You can call them whatever you want as long as they're letters, numbers, or underscores. You can experiment a little bit about that when you're working. You can't begin a variable name with a number, for example, but you should begin a variable name with a letter, and that'll be discussed in the style guide. But these are variables. Variables are names pointing to objects. So you can see that we've assigned, or we're binding, but we usually say assignment or initialize. We're assigning the integer object 5 to the name myInt, and then the float object to yourFloat, the string object to myXX. These are being assigned or bound, or we can say that this variable has been initialized. Whatever name we use, we're talking about a variable. That is a name bound to an object, a name pointing to or referring to an object. Now, the reason we do this is the same reason that we do this in Excel. We put a value into a cell, and we can now refer to that value from the cell address. In Python, we use names. We use variable names. And once we've done that, we can now refer to that variable later on. So in line 9 and line 10, as you can see, I'm printing myInt, and then I'm printing myInt, yourFloat, and myXX, we could talk briefly about print. Print will take whatever you give to it and reflect it to the screen. So when I run this, again, you see 5, 5.0, and 15. When I print myInt, you see 5. When I print 3 objects, I'm going to call them objects from now on. When we say, myInt is an int object, what we're really saying, without using the words, is myInt is a variable name that points to an integer object. But I'm not going to keep saying that. Instead, I'm going to conflate it and say that myInt is an integer. Your float is a floating point number. It's a float object. MyXX is a string. Really, they're just pointing to those objects, but we're going to conflate it and call these things objects. MyInt is an int object. So on line 9, when I print myInt, I'm seeing 5 because I've printed the integer object. And you can see on line 10, it's possible to print multiple objects in one call. I'm calling print. We'll talk about functions in a little bit. I print myInt, your float, myXX. What I'm doing is saying print each of these objects. And as you can see, what Python does is insert a space in between each object. So these are the object types that we're going to be working with. And we've defined 2 very important terms. First, object, which is just a data value, and variable, which is a name bound to an object.